The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 9, Government of the City, the King. 1. Religious Authority of the King. We should not picture to ourselves a city at its foundation deliberating on the form of government that it will adopt, devising and discussing its laws, and preparing its institutions. It was not thus that laws were made, and that governments were established. The political institutions of the city were born with the city itself, and on the same day with it. Every member of the city carried them within himself, for the germ of them was in each man's belief and religion. Religion prescribed that the hearth should always have a supreme priest. It did not permit the sacerdotal authority to be divided. The domestic hearth had a high priest who was the father of the family. The hearth of the curie had its curio or phratriarch. Every tribe, in the similar manner, had its religious chief, whom the Athenians called the king of the tribe. It was also necessary that the city religion should have its supreme priest. This priest of the public hearth bore the name of king. Sometimes they gave him other titles. As he was especially the priest of the Prytaneum, the Greeks preferred to call him the Prytane. Sometimes also they called him the Archon. Under these different names of king, Prytane, and Archon, we are to see a personage who is, above all, the chief of the worship. He keeps up the fire, offers the sacrifice, pronounces the prayer, and presides at the religious repasts. It may be worthwhile to offer proof that the ancient kings of Greece and Italy were priests. In Aristotle we read, "The care of the public sacrifices of the city belongs, according to religious custom, not to special priests, but to those men who derive their dignity from the hearth, and who in one place are called kings, in another prytanes, and in a third archons." Thus writes Aristotle, the man who best understood the constitution of the Greek cities. This passage, so precise, shows, in the first place, that the three words, king, prytane, and archon, were a long time synonymous. So true is this that an ancient historian, Charon of Lampsacus, writing a book about the kings of Lacedaemon, entitled it Archons and Prytanes of the Lacedaemonians. It shows also that the personage to whom was applied indifferently one of these three names, perhaps all of them at the same time, was the priest of the city, and that the worship of the public hearth was the source of his dignity and power. This sacerdotal character of primitive royalty is clearly indicated by the ancient writers. In Aeschylus, the daughters of Danaus address the king of Argos in these terms: "Thou art the supreme prytane, and watchest over the hearth of this country." In Euripides, Orestes, the murderer of his mother, says to Menelaus, "It is just that I, the son of Agamemnon, should reign at Argos." And Menelaus replies, "Art thou then fit, thou, a murderer, to touch the vessels of lustral water for the sacrifices? Art thou fit to slay the victims?" The principal office of a king was, therefore, to perform religious ceremonies. An ancient king of Sicyon was deposed because, having soiled his hands by a murder, he was no longer in a condition to offer the sacrifices. Being no longer fit for a priest, he could no longer be king. Homer and Virgil represent the kings as continually occupied with sacred ceremonies. We know from Demosthenes that the ancient kings of Attica performed themselves all the sacrifices that were prescribed by the religion of the city, and from Xenophon that the kings of Sparta were the chiefs of the Lacedaemonian religion. The Etruscan Lucumones were, at the same time, magistrates, military chiefs, and pontiffs. The case was not at all different with the Roman kings. Tradition always represents them as priests. The first was Romulus, who was acquainted with the science of augury, and who founded the city in accordance with religious rites. The second was Numa. He fulfilled, Livy tells us, the greater part of the priestly functions, but he foresaw that his successors, often having wars to maintain, would not always be able to take care of the sacrifices, and instituted the flamens to replace the kings when the latter were absent from Rome. Thus the Roman priesthood was only an emanation from the primitive royalty. These king-priests were inaugurated with a religious ceremonial. The new king, being conducted to the summit of the Capitoline Hill, was seated upon a stone seat, his face turned toward the south. On his left was seated an augur, his head covered with the sacred fillets, and holding in his hand the augur's staff. He marked off certain lines in the heavens, pronounced a prayer, and placing his hand upon the king's head, supplicated the gods to show, by a visible sign, that this chief was agreeable to them. Then, as soon as a flash of lightning or a flight of birds had manifested the will of the gods, the new king took possession of his charge. Livy describes this ceremony for the installation of Numa. Dionysius assures us that it took place for all the kings, and after the kings, for the consuls. He adds that it was still performed in his time. There was a reason for such a custom, as the king was to be supreme chief of the religion, and the safety of the city was to depend upon his prayers and sacrifices. It was important to make sure in the first place that this king was accepted by the gods. The ancients have left us no account of the manner in which the Spartan kings were elected, but we may be certain that the will of the gods was consulted in the election. We can even see from old customs which survived to the end of the history of Sparta, that the ceremony by which the gods were consulted was renewed every 9 years. So fearful were they that the king might lose the favor of the divinity. Every 9 years, says Plutarch, the ephors chose a very clear night, but without a moon, and sat in silence with their eyes fixed upon the heavens. If they saw a star cross from one quarter of the heavens to the other, this indicated that the kings were guilty of some neglect of the gods. The kings were then suspended from their duties till an oracle came from Delphi to relieve them from their forfeiture. 2. Political authority of the king. Just as, in the family, the authority was inherent in the priesthood, and the father, as head of the domestic worship, was at the same time judge and master, so the high priest of the city was at the same time its political chief. The altar, to borrow an expression of Aristotle, conferred dignity and power upon him. There is nothing to surprise us in this confusion of the priesthood and the civil power. We find it at the beginning of almost all societies, either because, during the infancy of a people, nothing but religion will command their obedience, or because our nature feels the need of not submitting to any other power than that of a moral idea. We have seen how the religion of the city was mixed up with everything. Man felt himself at every moment dependent upon his gods, and consequently upon this priest, who was placed between them and himself. This priest watched over the sacred fire. It was, as Pindar says, his daily worship that saved the city every day. He it was who knew the formulas and prayers which the gods could not resist. At the moment of combat, he it was who slew the victim and drew upon the army the protection of the gods. It was very natural that a man armed with such a power should be accepted and recognized as a leader. From the fact that religion had so great a part in the government, in the courts, and in war, it necessarily followed that the priest was at the same time magistrate, judge, and military chief. The kings of Sparta, says Aristotle, have 3 attributes. They perform the sacrifices, they command in war, and they administer justice. Dionysius of Halicarnassus expresses himself in the same manner regarding the kings of Rome. The constitutional rules of this monarchy were very simple. It was not necessary to seek long for them, they flowed from the rules of the worship themselves. The founder, who had established the sacred fire, was naturally the first priest. Hereditary succession was the constant rule, in the beginning, for the transmission of this worship. Whether the sacred fire was that of a family or that of a city, religion prescribed that the care of supporting it should always pass from father to son. The priesthood was therefore hereditary, and the power went with it. A well-known fact in the history of Greece proves, in a striking manner, that in the beginning the kingly office belonged to the man who set up the hearth of the city. We know that the population of the Ionian colonies was not composed of Athenians, but that it was a mixture of Pelasgians, Aeolians, Abantes, and Cadmeans. Yet all the hearths of the cities were placed by the members of the religious family of Codrus. It followed that these colonists, instead of having for leaders men of their own race, the Pelasgi a Pelasgian, the Abantes an Albantian, the Aeolians an Aeolian, all gave the royalty in their 12 cities to the Codridae. Assuredly these persons had not acquired their authority by force, for they were almost the only Athenians in this numerous agglomeration. But as they had established the sacred fires, it was their office to maintain them. The royalty was therefore bestowed upon them without a contest, and remained hereditary in their families. Battus had founded Cyrene in Africa, and the Batidae were a long time in possession of the royal dignity there. Protis founded Marseille, and the Protiidae, from father to son, performed the priestly office there, and enjoyed great privileges. It was not force, then, that created chiefs and kings in those ancient cities. It would not be correct to say that the first man who was king there was a lucky soldier. Authority flowed from the worship of the sacred fire. Religion created the king in the city, as it had made the family chief in the house. A belief, an unquestionable and imperious belief, declared that the hereditary priest of the hearth was the depositary of the holy duties and the guardian of the gods. How could one hesitate to obey such a man? A king was a sacred being, Vasilisieri, says Pindar. Men saw in him not a complete god, but at least the most powerful man to call down the anger of the gods, the man without whose aid no prayer was heard, no sacrifice accepted. This royalty, semi-religious, semi-political, was established in all cities from their foundation, without effort on the part of the kings, without resistance on the part of the subjects. We do not see at the origin of the ancient nations those fluctuations and struggles which mark the painful establishment of modern societies. We know how long a time was necessary, after the fall of the Roman Empire, to restore the rules of a regular society. Europe saw during several centuries opposing principles dispute for the government of the people, and the people at times rejecting all social organization. No such spectacle was seen in ancient Greece, or in ancient Italy. Their history does not commence with conflicts. Revolutions appeared only at the close. Among these populations, society formed slowly and by degrees, while passing from the family to the tribe and from the tribe to the city, but without shock and without a struggle. Royalty was established quite naturally, in the family first, in the city later. It was not devised in the imagination of a few. It grew out of a necessity that was manifest to the eyes of all. During long ages it was peaceable, honored, and obeyed. The kings had no need of material force. They had neither army nor treasury. But, sustained by a faith that had a powerful influence over the mind, their authority was sacred and inviolable. A revolution, of which we shall speak farther on, overturned the kingly power in every city. But when it fell, it left no rancor in the hearts of men. That contempt mingled with hatred which ordinarily attends on fallen grandeur, it never experienced. Fallen as it was, the affection and respect of men remained attached to its memory. In Greece, we see something which is not very common in history. In cities where the royal family did not become extinct, not only was it not expelled, but the same men who had despoiled it of power continued to honor it. At Ephesus, at Marseille, at Cyrene, the royal family, deprived of power, remained surrounded with the respect of the people, and even retained the title and insignia of royalty. The people established republican institutions, but the name of king, far from becoming a reproach, remained a venerated title. It is customary to say that this word was odious and despised. This is a singular error. The Romans applied it to the gods in their prayers. If the usurpers dared not assume this title, it was not because it was odious, but rather because it was sacred. In Greece, monarchy was many times restored in the cities, but the new monarchs never claimed the right to be called kings, and were satisfied to be called tyrants. What made the difference in these names was not the more or fewer moral qualities found in the sovereign. It was not the custom to call a good prince king and a bad one tyrant. Religion was what distinguished one from the other. The primitive kings had performed the duties of priests, and had derived their authority from the sacred fire. The tyrants of a later epoch were merely political chiefs and owed their elevation to force or election only. Book 3, Chapter 10, The Magistracy. The union of the political authority and the priesthood in the same person did not cease with royalty. The revolution which established the republican regime did not separate functions whose connection appeared natural, and was then the fundamental law of human society. The magistrate who replaced the king was, like him, a priest, and at the same time a political chief. Sometimes this annual magistrate bore the sacred title of king. In other places, the title of prytane, which he retained, indicated his principal function. In other cities, the title of archon prevailed. At Thebes, for example, the first magistrate was called by this name. But what Plutarch says of this office shows that it differed little from the priesthood. This archon, during his term of office, was required to wear a crown, as became a priest. Religion forbade him to let his hair grow, or to carry any iron object upon his person, a regulation which made him resemble the Roman flamen. The city of Plataea also had an archon, and the religion of this city required that, during his whole term of office, he should be clothed in white, that is to say, in the sacred color. The Athenian archons, when entering upon their duty, ascended the Acropolis, their heads crowned with myrtle, and offered a sacrifice to the divinity of the city. It was also a custom for them, in the exercise of their duty, to wear a crown of leaves upon their heads. Now it is certain that the crown, which in the course of time became, and has remained, the symbol of power, was then only a religious emblem, an exterior sign, which accompanied prayer and sacrifice. Among the 9 archons, the one called king was especially a religious chief, but each of his colleagues had some sacerdotal function to fulfill, some sacrifice to offer to the gods. The Greeks had a general expression to designate magistrates. They said ouenteli, which signified literally those who are to accomplish the sacrifice, an old expression indicating the idea that was entertained of the magistrate in early times. Pindar says of these personages that, by the offerings which they make to the sacred fire, they assure the safety of the city. At Rome, the first act of the consul was to offer a sacrifice in the forum. Victims were brought to the public square. When the pontiff had declared them worthy of being offered, the consul immolated them with his own hand, while a herald enjoined a religious silence upon the multitude, and a flute player sounded the sacred air. A few days later, the consul repaired to Lavinium, whence the Roman Penates had come, and offered another sacrifice. When we examine the character of the magistrate among the ancients with a little attention, we see how slightly he resembled the chief of state of modern societies. Priesthood, justice, and command are confounded in his person. He represents the city, which is a religious association as much, at least, as a political one. He has in his hands the auspices, the rites, prayer, the protection of the gods. A consul is something more than a man. He is a mediator between man and the divinity. To his fortune is attached the great public fortune. He is, as it were, the tutelary genius of the city. The death of a consul is calamitous to the republic. When the consul Claudius Nero left his army to fly to the succor of his colleague, Livy shows us into how great alarm Rome was thrown for the fate of this army. This was because, deprived of its chief, the army was at the same time deprived of its celestial protection. With the consul, the auspices had gone, that is to say, religion and the gods. The other Roman magistracies, which were, in a certain sense, members successively detached from the consulship, like that office, united sacerdotal and political attributes. We have seen the censor on certain days with a crown upon his head, offering a sacrifice in the name of the city, and striking down a victim with his own hand. The praetors and the curule aediles presided at religious festivals. There was no magistrate who had not some sacred act to perform, for in the minds of the ancients all authority ought to have some connection with religion. The tribunes of the people were the only ones who had no sacrifice to offer, but they were not counted among the real magistrates. We shall see farther along that their authority was of an entirely exceptional nature. The sacerdotal character belonging to the magistrate is shown, above all, in the manner of his election. In the eyes of the ancients, the votes of men were not sufficient to establish the ruler of a city. So long as the primitive royalty lasted, it appeared natural that this ruler should be designated by birth, by virtue of the religious law which prescribed that the son should succeed the father in every priestly office. Birth seemed sufficiently to reveal the will of the gods. When revolutions had everywhere suppressed this royalty, men appear to have sought, in the place of birth, a mode of election which the gods might not have to disavow. The Athenians, like many Greek peoples, saw no better way than to draw lots, but we must not form a wrong idea of this procedure, which has been made a subject of reproach against the Athenian democracy, and for this reason it is necessary that we attempt to penetrate the view of the ancients on this point. For them, the lot was not chance. It was the revelation of the divine will. Just as they had recourse to it in the temples to discover the secrets of the gods, so the city had recourse to it for the choice of its magistrate. It was believed that the gods designated the most worthy by making his name leap out of the urn. This was the opinion of Plato himself, who says, "He on whom the lot falls is the ruler, and is dear to the gods, and this we affirm to be quite just. The officers of the temple shall be appointed by lot. In this way their election will be committed to God, who will do what is agreeable to him." The city believed that in this manner it received its magistrates from the gods. Affairs are substantially the same at Rome. The designation of a consul did not belong to men. The will or the caprice of the people could not legitimately create a magistrate. This, therefore, was the manner in which the consul was chosen. A magistrate in charge, that is to say, a man already in possession of the sacred character and of the auspices, indicated among the dies fasti the one on which the consul ought to be named. During the night which preceded this day, he watched in the open air, his eyes fixed upon the heavens, observing the signs which the gods sent, whilst he pronounced mentally the name of some candidate for the magistracy. If the presages were favorable, it was because the gods accepted the candidate. The next day the people assembled in the Campus Martius. The same one who had consulted the gods presided at the assembly. He pronounced in a loud voice the names of the candidates concerning whom he had taken the auspices. If among those who sought the consulship there was one for whom the auspices had not been favorable, his name was omitted. The people voted upon those names only which had been pronounced by the president. If the president named but 2 candidates, the people necessarily voted for them. If he named 3, they chose 2 of them. The assembly never had the right to vote for other men than those whom the president had designated, for the auspices had been for those only, and for those only had the consent of the gods been assured. This mode of election, which was scrupulously followed in the first ages of the Republic, explains some peculiarities of Roman history which at first surprise us. We see, for example, that quite frequently the people were unanimous for 2 men for the consulship, and still they are not elected. This is because the president has not taken the auspices concerning these 2 men, or the auspices have not been favorable. On the other hand, we have seen the people elect to the consulship men whom they detested. This was because the president pronounced only these 2 names. It was absolutely necessary to vote for them, for the vote was not expressed by yes or no. Every vote was required to contain 2 names, and none could be written except those that had been designated. The people, when candidates were presented who were odious to them, could indeed show their displeasure by retiring without a vote, but there always remained in the enclosure citizens enough to make up a quorum. Here we see how great was the power of the president of the comitia, and we no longer wonder at the expression creat consules.
which referred not to the people, but to the president of the comitia. It was of him indeed, rather than of the people, that it might be said, he creates the consuls, for he was the one who discovered the will of the gods. If he did not create the consuls, it was at least through him that the gods created them. The power of the people went no farther than to ratify the election, or at most, to select among 3 or 4 names, if the auspices had been equally favorable to 3 or 4 candidates. Doubtless this method of procedure was very advantageous to the Roman aristocracy, but we should deceive ourselves if we saw in all this merely a ruse invented by them. Such a ruse was never thought of in the ages when they believed in this religion. Politically, it was useless in the first ages, since at that time the patricians had a majority in voting. It might even have been turned against them by investing a single man with exorbitant power. The only explanation that can be given of this custom, or rather of these rights of election, is that everyone then sincerely believed that the choice of the magistrates belonged not to the people, but to the gods. The man in whose hands the religion and the fortune of the city were to be placed ought to be revealed by the divine voice. The first rule for the election of a magistrate is the one given by Cicero, that he be named according to the rights. If, several months afterwards, the Senate was told that some rite had been neglected or badly performed, it ordered the consuls to abdicate, and they obeyed. The examples are very numerous, and if in the case of 2 or 3 of them we may believe that the Senate was very glad to be rid of an ill-qualified or ill-intentioned consul, the greater part of the time, on the contrary, we cannot impute other motives to them than religious scruples. When the lot or the auspices had designated an archon or a consul, there was, it is true, a sort of proof by which the merits of the newly elected officer were examined. But even this will show us what the city wished to find in its magistrate, and we shall see that it sought not the most courageous warrior, not the ablest and most upright man in peace, but the one best loved by the gods. Indeed, the Athenian Senate inquired of the magistrate-elect if he had any bodily defect, if he possessed a domestic god, if his family had always been faithful to his worship, if he himself had always fulfilled his duties towards the dead. Why these questions? Because a bodily defect, a sign of the anger of the gods, rendered a man unfit to fill any priestly office, and consequently to exercise any magistracy, because he who had no family worship ought not to have a national worship, and was not qualified to offer the sacrifices in the name of the city. Because if his family had not always been faithful to his worship, that is to say, if one of his ancestors had committed one of those acts which affect religion, the hearth was forever contaminated, and the descendants were detested by the gods. Finally, because if he himself had neglected the tomb of his dead, he was exposed to their dangerous anger and was pursued by invisible enemies. The city would have been very daring to have confided its fortunes to such a man. These are the principal questions that were addressed to one who was about to become a magistrate. It appeared that men did not trouble themselves about his character or his knowledge. They tried especially to assure themselves that he was qualified for the priestly office and that the religion of the city would not be compromised in his hands. This sort of examination was also in use at Rome. We have not, it is true, any information as to the questions which the consul was required to answer, but it is enough to know that this examination was made by the pontiffs.
The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 11, The Law. Among the Greeks and Romans, as among the Hindus, law was at first a part of religion. The ancient codes of the cities were a collection of rites, liturgical directions, and prayers, joined with legislative regulations. The laws concerning property and those concerning succession were scattered about in the midst of rules for sacrifices, for burial, and for the worship of the dead. What remains to us of the oldest laws of Rome, which were called the royal laws, relates as often to the worship as to the relations of civil life. One forbade a guilty woman to approach the altars, another forbade certain dishes to be served in the sacred repasts. A third prescribed what religious ceremony a victorious general ought to perform on re-entering the city. The Code of the 12 Tables, although more recent, still contained minute regulations concerning the religious rites of sepulture. The work of Solon was at the same time a code, a constitution, and a ritual. It regulated the order of sacrifices and the price of victims, as well as the marriage rites and the worship of the dead. Cicero, in his Laws, traces a plan of legislation which is not entirely imaginary. In the substance, as in the form of his code, he imitates the ancient legislators. Now, these are the first laws he writes. Let men approach the gods with purity. Let the temples of the ancestors and the dwelling of the Lares be kept up. Let the priests employ in the sacred repasts only the prescribed kinds of food. Let everyone offer to the manas the worship that is due them. Assuredly, the Roman philosopher troubled himself little about the old religion of the Lares and the manas, but he was tracing a code in imitation of the ancient codes, and he believed himself bound to insert rules of worship. At Rome, it was a recognized truth that no one could be a good pontiff who did not know the law, and conversely that no one could know the law if he did not understand questions relating to religion. The pontiffs were for a long time the only jurisconsults. As there was hardly an act of life which had not some relation to religion, it followed that almost everything was submitted to the decision of these priests, and that they were the only competent judges in an infinite number of cases. All disputes regarding marriage, divorce, and the civil and religious rights of infants were carried to their tribunal. They were judges in cases of incest as well as of celibacy. As adoption affected religion, it could not take place without the consent of the pontiff. To make a will was to break the order that religion had established for the transmission of property and of the worship. The will, therefore, in the beginning, required to be authorized by the pontiff. As the limits of every man's land were established by religion, whenever two neighbors had a dispute about boundaries, they had to plead before the priests, called fratres arvales. This explains why the same men were pontiffs and jurists. Law and religion were but one. At Athens, the archon and the king had very nearly the same judicial functions as the Roman pontiff. The origin of ancient laws appears clearly. No man invented them. Solon, Lycurgus, Minos, Numa might have reduced the laws of their cities to writing, but they could not have made them. If we understand by legislator a man who creates a code by the power of his genius, and who imposes it upon other men, this legislator never existed among the ancients. Nor did ancient law originate with the votes of the people. The idea that a certain number of votes might make a law did not appear in the cities until very late, and only after 2 revolutions had transformed them. Up to that time, laws had appeared to men as something ancient, immutable, and venerable. As old as the city itself, the founder had established them at the same time that he established the hearth. Moresque viris et moenia ponit. He instituted them at the same time that he instituted the religion. Still, it could not be said that he had prepared them himself. Who then was the true author of them? When we spoke above of the organization of the family, and of the Greek and Roman laws which regulated property, succession, wills, and adoption, we observed how exactly these laws corresponded to the beliefs of ancient generations. If we compare these laws with natural equity, we often find them opposed to it, and we can easily see that it was not in the notion of absolute right and in the sentiment of justice that they were sought for. But place these laws by the side of the worship of the dead and of the sacred fire, compare them with the rules of this primitive religion, and they appear in perfect accord with all of this. Man did not need to study his conscience and say, this is just, this is unjust. Ancient law was not produced in this way. But man believed that the sacred hearth, in virtue of the religious law, passed from father to son. From this it followed that the house was hereditary property. The man who had buried his father in his field believed that the spirit of the dead one took possession of this field forever, and required a perpetual worship of his posterity. As a result of this, the field, the domain of the dead, and the place of sacrifice became the inalienable property of a family. Religion said, the son continues the worship, not the daughter. And the law said, with the religion, the son inherits, the daughter does not inherit. The nephew by the males inherits, but not the nephew on the female side. This was the manner in which the laws were made. They presented themselves without being sought. They were the direct and necessary consequence of the belief. They were religion itself, applied to the relations of men among themselves. The ancients said their laws came from the gods. The Cretans attributed their laws not to Minos but to Jupiter. The Lacedaemonians believed that their legislator was not Lycurgus but Apollo. The Romans believed that Numa wrote under the dictation of one of the most powerful divinities of ancient Italy, the goddess Egeria. The Etruscans had received their laws from the god Tagus. There is truth in all these traditions. The veritable legislator among the ancients was not a man, but the religious belief which men entertained. The laws long remained sacred. Even at the time when it was admitted that the will of a man, or the votes of a people, might make a law, it was still necessary that religion should be consulted, and at least that its consent should be obtained. At Rome, it was not believed that a unanimous vote was sufficient to make a law binding. The decision of the people required to be ratified by the pontiffs, and the augurs were required to attest that the gods were favorable to the proposed law. One day, when the tribunes of the people wished to have a law adopted by the assembly of the tribes, a patrician said to them, "What right have you to make a new law, or to touch existing laws, you who have not the auspices, you who in your assemblies perform no religious acts? What have you in common with religion and sacred things, among which must be reckoned the laws?" From this we can understand the respect and attachment which the ancients long had for their laws. In them they saw no human work, but one whose origin was holy. It was no vain word when Plato said, "To obey the laws is to obey the gods." He does no more than to express the Greek idea when, in Crito, he exhibits Socrates giving his life because the laws demanded it of him. Before Socrates there was written upon the rock of Thermopylae, "Passer-by, go and tell Sparta that we lie here in obedience to its laws." The law among the ancients was always holy, and in the time of royalty it was the queen of the kings. In the time of the republic it was the queen of the people. To disobey it was sacrilege. In principle, the laws were immutable, since they were divine. It is worthy of remark that they were never abrogated. Men could indeed make new ones, but old ones still remained, however they might conflict with the new ones. The Code of Draco was not abolished by that of Solon, nor were the royal laws by those of the 12 Tables. The stone on which the laws were engraved was inviolable, or at most, the least scrupulous only thought themselves permitted to turn it round. This principle was the great cause of the confusion which is observable among ancient laws. Contradictory laws and those of different epochs were found together, and all claimed respect. In an oration of Isaias, we find two men contesting an inheritance. Each quotes a law in his favor. The two laws are absolute contraries, and are equally sacred. In the same manner, the Code of Manu preserves the ancient law which establishes primogeniture, and has another by the side of it which enjoins an equal division among the brothers. The ancient law never gave any reasons. Why should it? It was not bound to give them. It existed because the gods had made it. It was not discussed. It was imposed. It was a work of authority, men obeyed it because they had faith in it. During long generations, the laws were not written. They were transmitted from father to son, with the creed and the formula of prayer. They were a sacred tradition, which was perpetuated around the family hearth, or the hearth of the city. The day on which men began to commit them to writing, they consigned them to the sacred books, to the rituals among prayers and ceremonies. Varro cites an ancient law of the city of Tusculum, and adds that he read it in the sacred books of that city. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who had consulted the original documents, says that before the time of the decemvirs, all the written laws at Rome were to be found in the books of the priests. Later, the laws were removed from the rituals and were written by themselves, but the custom of depositing them in a temple continued, and priests had the care of them. Written or unwritten, these laws were always formulated into very brief sentences, which may be compared in form to the verses of Leviticus, or the slokas of the Book of Manu. It is quite probable even that the laws were rhythmical. According to Aristotle, before the laws were written, they were sung. Traces of this custom have remained in language. The Romans called the laws carmina, verses. The Greeks said nomoi, songs. These ancient verses were invariable texts. To change a letter of them, to displace a word, to alter the rhythm, was to destroy the law itself by destroying the sacred form under which it was revealed to man. The law was like prayer, which was agreeable to the divinity only on condition that it was recited correctly, and which became impious if a single word in it was changed. In primitive law, the exterior, the letter, is everything. There is no need of seeking the sense or spirit of it. The value of the law is not in the moral principle that it contains, but in the words that make up the formula. Its force is in the sacred words that compose it. Among the ancients, and especially at Rome, the idea of law was inseparably connected with certain sacramental words. If, for example, it was a question of contract, one was expected to say, "Da respondes," and the other was expected to reply, "Spondeo." If these words were not pronounced, there was no contract. In vain the creditor came to demand payment of the debt. The debtor owed nothing. For what placed a man under obligation in this ancient law was not conscience, or the sentiment of justice. It was the sacred formula. When this formula was pronounced between two men, it established between them a legal obligation. Where there was no formula, the obligation did not exist. The strange forms of ancient Roman legal procedure would not surprise us if we but recollected that ancient law was a religion, a sacred text, and justice a collection of rights. The plaintiff pursues with the law, agit lege. By the text of the law he seizes his adversary, but let him be on his guard. To have the law on his side, he must know its terms, and pronounce them exactly. If he speaks one word for another, the law exists no longer for him, and cannot defend him. Gaines gives an account of a man whose vines had been cut by his neighbor. The fact was settled. He pronounced the law. But the law said trees. He pronounced vines, and lost his case. Repeating the law was not sufficient. There was also needed an accompaniment of exterior signs, which were, so to say, the rites of this religious ceremony called a contract, or a case in law. For this reason, at every sale, the little piece of copper and the balance were employed. To buy an article, it was necessary to touch it with the hand, mancipatio, and if there was a dispute about a piece of property, there was a feigned combat, manuum concertio. Hence were derived the forms of liberation, those of emancipation, those of illegal action, and all the pantomime of legal procedure. As law was a part of religion, it participated in the mysterious character of all this religion of the cities. The legal formulas, like those of religion, were kept secret. They were concealed from the stranger, and even from the plebeian. This was not because the patricians had calculated that they should possess great power in the exclusive knowledge of the law, but because the law, by its origin and nature, long appeared to be a mystery, to which one could be initiated only after having first been initiated into the national worship and the domestic worship. The religious origin of ancient law also explains to us one of the principal characteristics of this law. Religion was purely civil, that is to say, peculiar to each city. There could flow from it, therefore, only a civil law. But it is necessary to distinguish the sense which this word had among the ancients. When they said that the law was civil, jus civile, nomoi politikoi, they did not understand simply that every city had its code, as in our day every state has a code. They meant that their laws had no force or power except between members of the same city. To live in a city did not make one subject to its laws and place him under their protection. One had to be a citizen. The law did not exist for the slave, no more did it exist for the stranger. We shall see further along that the stranger domiciled in a city could be neither a proprietor there, nor an heir, nor a testator. He could not make a contract of any sort, or appear before the ordinary tribunals of the citizens. At Athens, if he happened to be the creditor of a citizen, he could not sue him in the courts for the payment of the debt, as the law recognized no contract as valid for him. These provisions of ancient law were perfectly logical. Law was not born of the idea of justice, but of religion, and was not conceived as going beyond it. In order that there should be a legal relation between two men, it was necessary that there should already exist a religious relation, that is to say, that they should worship at the same hearth and have the same sacrifices. When this religious community did not exist, it did not seem that there could be any legal relation. Now, neither the stranger nor the slave had any part in the religion of the city. A foreigner and a citizen might live side by side during long years, without one's thinking of the possibility of a legal relation being established between them. Law was nothing more than one phase of religion. Where there was no common religion, there was no common law. The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 12, The Citizen and the Stranger. The citizen was recognized by the fact that he had a part in the religion of the city, and it was from this participation that he derived all his civil and political rights. If he renounced the worship, he renounced the rights. We have already spoken of the public meals, which were the principal ceremony of the national worship. Now, at Sparta, one who did not join in these, even if it was not his fault, ceased at once to be counted among the citizens. At Athens, one who did not take part in the festivals of the national gods lost the rights of a citizen. At Rome, it was necessary to have been present at the sacred ceremony of the lustration in order to enjoy political rights. The man who had not taken part in this, that is to say, who had not joined in the common prayer and the sacrifice, lost his citizenship until the next lustration. If we wished to give an exact definition of a citizen, we should say that it was a man who had the religion of the city. The stranger, on the contrary, is one who has not access to the worship, one whom the gods of the city do not protect, and who has not even the right to invoke them. For these national gods do not wish to receive prayers and offering except from citizens. They repulse the stranger. Entrance into their temples is forbidden to him, and his presence during the sacrifice is a sacrilege. Evidence of this ancient sentiment of repulsion has remained in one of the principal rites of Roman worship. The pontiff, when he sacrifices in the open air, must have his head veiled. For before the sacred fires in the religious act which is offered to the national gods, the face of a stranger must not appear to the pontiff, the auspices would be disturbed. A sacred object which fell for a moment into the hands of a stranger at once became profane. It could not recover its religious character except by an expiatory ceremony. If the enemy seized a city, and the citizens succeeded in recovering it, above all things it was important that the temples should be purified and all the fires extinguished and rekindled. The presence of the stranger had defiled them. Thus religion established between the citizen and the stranger a profound and ineffaceable distinction. This same religion, so long as it held sway over the minds of men, forbade the right of citizenship to be granted to a stranger. In the time of Herodotus, Sparta had accorded it to no one except the prophet, and even for this the formal command of the oracle was necessary. Athens granted it sometimes, but with what precautions? First, it was necessary that the united people should vote by secret ballot for the admission of the stranger. Even this was nothing as yet. 9 days afterwards, a second assembly had to confirm the previous vote, and in this second case, 6,000 votes were required in favor of the admission, a number which will appear enormous when we recollect that it was very rare for an Athenian assembly to comprise so many citizens. After this, a vote of the Senate was required to confirm the decision of this double assembly. Finally, any citizen could oppose a sort of veto and attack the decree as contrary to the ancient laws. Certainly there was no other public act where the legislator was surrounded with so many difficulties and precautions as that which conferred upon a stranger the title of citizen. The formalities to go through were not near so great in declaring war or in passing a new law. Why should these men oppose so many obstacles to a stranger who wished to become a citizen? Assuredly they did not fear that in the political assemblies his vote would turn the balance. Demosthenes gives us the true motive and the true thought of the Athenians. It is because the purity of the sacrifices must be preserved. To exclude the stranger was to watch over the sacred ceremonies. To admit a stranger among the citizens was to give him a part in the religion and in the sacrifices. Now, for such an act, the people did not consider themselves entirely free, and were seized with religious scruples, for they knew that the national gods were disposed to repulse the stranger, and that the sacrifices would perhaps be rendered useless by the presence of the newcomer. The gift of the rights of a citizen to a stranger was a real violation of the fundamental principles of the national religion, and it is for this reason that, in the beginning, the city was so sparing of it. We must also note that the man admitted to citizenship with so much difficulty could be neither archon nor priest. The city indeed permitted him to take part in its worship, but as to presiding at it, that would have been too much. No one could become a citizen of Athens if he was a citizen in another city, for it was a religious impossibility to be at the same time a member of 2 cities, as it also was to be a member of 2 families. One could not have 2 religions at the same time. The participation in the worship carried with it the possession of rights. As the citizen might assist in the sacrifice which preceded the assembly, he could also vote at the assembly. As he could perform the sacrifices in the name of the city, he might be a prytane and an archon. Having the religion of the city, he might claim rights under its laws and perform all the ceremonies of legal procedure. The stranger, on the contrary, having no part in the religion, had none in the law. If he entered the sacred enclosure which the priests had traced for the assembly, he was punished with death. The laws of the city did not exist for him. If he had committed a crime, he was treated as a slave and punished without process of law, the city owing him no legal protection. When men arrived at that stage that they felt the need of having laws for the stranger, it was necessary to establish an exceptional tribunal. At Rome, in order to judge the alien, the praetor had to become an alien himself, praetor peregrinus. At Athens, the judge of foreigners was the polemarch,
that is to say, the magistrate who was charged with cares of war and of all transactions with the enemy. Neither at Rome nor at Athens could a foreigner be a proprietor. He could not marry, or if he married, his marriage was not recognized, and his children were reputed illegitimate. He could not make a contract with a citizen. At any rate, the law did not recognize such a contract as valid. At first, he could take no part in commerce. The Roman law forbade him to inherit from a citizen, and even forbade a citizen to inherit from him. They pushed this principle so far that if a foreigner obtained the rights of a citizen without his son, born before this event, obtaining the same favor, the son became a foreigner in regard to his father and could not inherit from him. The distinction between citizen and foreigner was stronger than the natural tie between father and son. At first blush, it would seem as if the aim had been to establish a system that should be vexatious towards foreigners. But there was nothing of this. Athens and Rome, on the contrary, gave him a good reception, both for commercial and political reasons. But neither their goodwill nor their interest could abolish the ancient laws which religion had established. This religion did not permit the stranger to become a proprietor, because he could not have any part in the religious soil of the city. It permitted neither the foreigner to inherit from the citizen, nor the citizen to inherit from the foreigner, because every transmission of property carried with it the transmission of a worship, and it was as impossible for the citizen to perform the foreigner's worship as for the foreigner to perform the citizen's. Citizens could welcome the foreigner, watch over him, even esteem him if he was rich and honorable, but they could give him no part in their religion or their laws. The slave, in certain respects, was better treated than he was, because the slave, being a member of the family whose worship he shared, was connected with the city through his master. The gods protected him. The Roman religion taught, therefore, that the tomb of the slave was sacred, but that the foreigner's was not. A foreigner, to be of any account in the eyes of the law, to be enabled to engage in trade, to make contracts, to enjoy his property securely, to have the benefit of the laws of the city to protect him, must become the client of a citizen. Rome and Athens required every foreigner to adopt a patron. By choosing a citizen as a patron, the foreigner became connected with the city. Thenceforth, he participated in some of the benefits of the civil law, and its protection was secured. The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 13, Patriotism and Exile. The word country, among the ancients, signified the land of the fathers, terra patria, fatherland. The fatherland of every man was that part of the soil which his domestic or national religion had sanctified, the land where the remains of his ancestors were deposited, and which their souls occupied. His little fatherland was the family enclosure with its tomb and its hearth. The great fatherland was the city, with its prytaneum and its heroes, with its sacred enclosure and its territory marked out by religion. Sacred fatherland, the Greeks called it. Nor was it a vain word. This soil was indeed sacred to man, for his gods dwelt there. State, city, fatherland, these words were no abstraction as they are among the moderns. They really represented a group of local divinities with a daily worship and beliefs that had a powerful influence over the soul. This explains the patriotism of the ancients, an energetic sentiment which, for them, was the supreme virtue to which all other virtues tended. Whatever a man held most dear was associated with the idea of country. In it he found his property, his security, his laws, his faith, his God. Losing it, he lost everything. It was almost impossible that private and public interests could conflict. Plato says, "Our country begets us, nourishes us, educates us." And Sophocles says, "It is our country that preserves us." Such a country is not simply a dwelling place for man. Let him leave its sacred walls, let him pass the sacred limits of its territory,
and he no longer finds for himself either a religion or a social tie of any kind. Everywhere else, except in his own country, he is outside the regular life and the law. Everywhere else he is without a god, and shut out from all moral life. There alone he enjoys his dignity as a man and his duties. Only there can he be a man. Country holds man attached to it by a sacred tie. He must love it as he loves his religion, obey it as he obeys a god. He must give himself to it entirely. He must love his country whether it is glorious or obscure, prosperous or unfortunate. He must love it for its favors, and love it also for its severity. Socrates, unjustly condemned by it, must not love it the less. He must love it as Abraham loved his God, even to sacrificing his son for it. Above all, one must know how to die for it. The Greek or Roman rarely dies on account of his devotion to a man or for a point of honor, but to his country he owes his life. For if his country is attacked, his religion is attacked. He fights literally for his altars and his fires, pro aris et focis. For if the enemy takes his city, his altars are overturned, his fires are extinguished, his tombs are profaned, his gods are destroyed, his worship is effaced. The piety of the ancients was love of country. The possession of a country was very precious, for the ancients imagined few chastisements more cruel than to be deprived of it. The ordinary punishment of great crimes was exile. Exile was really the interdiction of worship. To exile a man was, according to the formula used both by the Greeks and the Romans, to cut him off from both fire and water. By this fire we are to understand the sacred fire of the hearth. By this water, the lustral water which served for the sacrifices. Exile, therefore, placed man beyond the reach of religion. "Let him flee," were the words of the sentence, "nor ever approach the temples. Let no citizen speak to or receive him. Let no one admit him to the prayers or the sacrifices. Let no one offer the lustral water." Every house was defiled by his presence. The man who received him became impure by his touch. "Anyone who shall have eaten or drank with him, or who shall have touched him," said the law, "should purify himself." Under the ban of this excommunication, the exile could take part in no religious ceremony. He no longer had a worship, sacred repasts, or prayers. He was disinherited of his portion of religion. We can easily understand that, for the ancients, God was not everywhere. If they had some vague idea of a God of the universe, this was not the one whom they considered as their providence, and whom they invoked. Every man's gods were those who inhabited his house, his canton, his city. The exile, on leaving his country behind him, also left his gods. He no longer found a religion that could console and protect him. He no longer felt that Providence was watching over him. The happiness of praying was taken away. All that could satisfy the needs of his soul was far away. Now, religion was the source whence flowed civil and political rights. The exile, therefore, lost all this in losing his religion and country. Excluded from the city worship, he saw at the same time his domestic worship taken from him, and was forced to extinguish his hearth fire. He could no longer hold property. His goods, as if he was dead, passed to his children, unless they were confiscated to the profit of the gods or of the state. Having no longer a worship, he had no longer a family. He ceased to be a husband and a father. His sons were no longer in his power. His wife was no longer his wife, and might immediately take another husband. Regulus, when a prisoner of the enemy, the Roman law looked upon as an exile. If the Senate asked his opinion, he refused to give it, because an exile was no longer a senator. If his wife and children ran to him, he repulsed their embraces, because for an exile there were no longer wife and children. Vertur pudice conjugis osculum, parvosque natos ut capitis minor asse removisse. The exile, says Xenophon, loses home, liberty, country, wife, and children. When he dies, he has not the right to be buried in the tomb of his family, for he is an alien. It is not surprising that the ancient republics almost all permitted a convict to escape death by flight. Exile did not seem a milder punishment than death. The Roman jurists called it capital punishment. The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 14, The Municipal Spirit. What we have already seen of ancient institutions, and above all of ancient beliefs, has enabled us to obtain an idea of the profound gulf which always separated two cities. However near they might be to each other, they always formed two completely separate societies. Between them, there was much more than the distance which separates two cities today, much more than the frontier which separates two states. Their gods were not the same, or their ceremonies, or their prayers. The worship of one city was forbidden to men of a neighboring city. The belief was that the gods of one city rejected the homage and prayers of anyone who was not their own citizen. These ancient beliefs, it is true, were modified and softened in the course of time. But they had been in their full vigor at the time when these societies were formed, and these societies always preserved the impression of them. Two facts we can easily understand. First, that this religion, peculiar to each city, must have established the city in a very strong and almost unchangeable manner. It is indeed marvelous how long this social organization lasted, in spite of all its faults and all its chances of ruin. Second, that the effect of this religion during long ages must have been to render it impossible to establish any other social form than the city. Every city, even by the requirements of its religion, was independent. It was necessary that each should have its particular code, since each had its own religion, and the law flowed from the religion. Each was required to have its sovereign tribunal, and there could be no judicial tribunal superior to that of the city. Each had its religious festivals and its calendar. The months and the year could not be the same in two cities, as the series of religious acts was different. Each had its own money, which at first was marked with its religious emblem. Each had its weights and measures. It was not admitted that there could be anything in common between two cities. The line of demarcation was so profound that one hardly imagined marriage possible between the inhabitants of two different cities. Such a union always appeared strange and was long considered illegal. The legislation of Rome and that of Athens were visibly averse to admitting it. Nearly everywhere, children born of such a marriage were confounded with bastards and deprived of the rights of citizens. To make a marriage legal between inhabitants of two cities, it was necessary that there should be between those cities a particular convention, jus connubii, epigamia. Every city had about its territory a line of sacred bounds. This was the horizon of its national religion and of its gods. Beyond these bounds, other gods reigned, and another worship was practiced. The most salient characteristic of the history of Greece and of Italy before the Roman conquest is the excessive division of property and the spirit of isolation in each city. Greece never succeeded in forming a single state, nor did the Latin or the Etruscan cities, or the Samnite tribes, succeed in forming a compact body. The incurable division of the Greeks has been attributed to the nature of their country, and we are told that the mountains which intersect each other established natural lines of demarcation among men. But there were no mountains between Thebes and Plataea, between Argos and Sparta, between Sybaris and Crotona. There were none between the cities of Latium, or between the 12 cities of Etruria. Doubtless physical nature has some influence upon the history of a people,
but the beliefs of men have a much more powerful one. In ancient times, there was something more impassable than mountains between two neighboring cities. There were the series of sacred bounds, the difference of worship, and the hatred of the gods towards the foreigner. For this reason, the ancients were never able to establish or even to conceive of any other social organization than the city. Neither the Greeks nor the Latins nor even the Romans, for a very long time, ever had a thought that several cities might be united and live on an equal footing under the same government. There might indeed be an alliance, or a temporary association in view of some advantage to be gained, or some danger to be repelled, but there was never a complete union, for religion made of every city a body which could never be joined to another. Isolation was the law of the city. With the beliefs and the religious usages which we have seen, how could several cities ever have become united in one state? Men did not understand human association, and it did not appear regular unless it was founded upon religion. The symbol of this association was a sacred repast partaken of in common. A few thousand citizens might indeed literally unite around the same prytaneum, recite the same prayer, and partake of the same sacred dishes. But how attempt with these usages to make a single state of entire Greece? How could men hold the public repasts and perform all the sacred ceremonies in which every citizen was bound to take a part? Where would they locate the prytaneum? How would they perform the annual lustration of the citizens? What would become of the inviolable limits which had from the beginning marked out the territory of the city, and which separated it forever from the rest of the earth's surface? What would become of all the local worships, the city divinities, and the heroes who inhabited every canton? Athens had within her limits the hero, Oedipus, the enemy of Thebes. How unite Athens and Thebes in the same worship under the same government? When these superstitions became weakened, and this did not happen till a late period in common minds, it was too late to establish a new form of state. The division had become consecrated by custom, by interest, by inveterate hatreds, and by the memory of past struggles. Men could no longer return to the past. Every city held fast to its autonomy. This was the name they gave to an assemblage which comprised their worship, their laws, their government, and their entire religious and political independence. It was easier for a city to subject another than to annex it. Victory might make slaves of all the inhabitants of a conquered city, but they could not be made citizens of the victorious city. To join two cities in a single state, to unite the conquered population with the victors and associate them under the same government, is what was never seen among the ancients, with one exception, of which we shall speak presently. If Sparta conquered Messenia, it was not to make of the Spartans and Messenians a single people. The Spartans expelled the whole race of the vanquished and took their lands. Athens proceeded in this same manner with Salamis, Aegina, and Melos. The thought of removing the conquered to the city of the victors could not enter the mind of anyone. The city possessed gods, hymns, festivals, and laws, which were its precious patrimony, and it took good care not to share these with the vanquished. It had not even the right to do this. Could Athens admit that a citizen of Aegina might enter into the temple of Athena Polias, that he might offer his worship to Theseus, that he might take part in the sacred repasts, that as a prytane he might keep up the public fire? Religion forbade it. The conquered population of the island of Aegina could not therefore form a single state with the population of Athens. Not having the same gods, the Aeginetans and the Athenians could not have the same laws or the same magistrates. But might not Athens at any rate leave the conquered city intact, send magistrates within its walls to govern it? It was absolutely contrary to the principles of the ancients to place any man over a city who was not a citizen of it. Indeed, the magistrate was a religious chief, and his principal function was to sacrifice in the name of the city. The foreigner, who had not the right to offer the sacrifice, could not therefore be a magistrate. Having no religious function, he had not in the eyes of men any regular authority. Sparta attempted to place its harmosts in the cities, but these men were not magistrates. They did not act as judges or appear in the assemblies. Having no regular relation with the people of the cities, they could not maintain themselves there for any great length of time. Every conqueror, consequently, had only the alternative of destroying a subdued city and occupying its territory, or of leaving it entirely independent. There was no middle course. Either the city ceased to exist, or it was a sovereign state. So long as it retained its worship, it retained its government. It lost the one only by losing the other, and then it existed no longer. This absolute independence of the ancient city could only cease when the belief on which it was founded had completely disappeared. After these ideas had been transformed and several revolutions had passed over these antique societies, then men might come to have an idea of, and to establish, a larger state, governed by other rules. But for this, it was necessary that men should discover other principles and other social bonds than those of the ancient ages.
The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 15. Relations between the cities. War, Peace, the Alliance of the Gods. This religion, which exercised so powerful an empire over the interior life of the city, intervened with the same authority in all relations between cities. We may see this by observing how men of those ancient ages carried on war, how they concluded peace, and how they formed alliances. Two cities were two religious associations which had not the same gods. When they were at war, it was not the men alone who fought. The gods also took part in the struggle. Let no one suppose that this was simply a poetical fiction. There was among the ancients a very definite and a very vivid belief, by reason of which each army took its gods along with it. Men believed that these gods took an active part in the battle. The soldiers defended them, and they defended the soldiers. While fighting against the enemy, each one believed he was fighting against the gods of another city. These foreign gods he was permitted to detest, to abuse, to strike. He might even make them prisoners. Thus, war had a strange aspect. We must picture to ourselves two armies facing each other. In the midst of each are its statues, its altar, and its standards, which are sacred emblems. Each has its oracles, who have promised it success, its augurs and its soothsayers, who assure it the victory. Before the battle, each soldier in the two armies thinks and says, like the Greek in Euripides, "The gods who fight for us are more powerful than those of our enemies." Each army pronounces against the other an imprecation like that which Macrobius has preserved. O gods, spread fear, terror, and misfortune among our enemies. Let these men and whoever inhabits their lands and cities be deprived by you of the light of the sun. May their city and their lands and their heads and their persons be devoted to you. After this imprecation, they rush to battle on both sides, with that savage fury which the notion that they have gods fighting for them, and that they are fighting against strange gods, inspires in them. There is no mercy for the enemy. War is implacable. Religion presides over the struggle and excites the combatants. There can be no superior rule to moderate the desire for slaughter. They are permitted to kill the prisoners and the wounded. Even outside the field of battle, they have no idea of a duty of any kind towards the enemy. There are never any rights for a foreigner, least of all in time of war. No one was required to distinguish the just from the unjust in respect to him. Mucius Scaevola and all the Romans believed it was a glorious deed to assassinate an enemy. The consul Marcius boasted publicly of having deceived the king of Macedonia. Paulus Emilius sold as slaves 100,000 Epirots who had voluntarily surrendered themselves to him. The Lacedaemonian Phoebus seized upon the citadel of the Thebans in time of peace. Agesilaus was questioned upon the justice of this action. "Inquire only if it is useful," said the king, "for whenever an action is useful to our country, it is right." This was the international law of ancient cities. Another king of Sparta, Cleomenes, said that all the evil one could do to enemies was always just in the eyes of gods and men. The conqueror could use his victory as he pleased. No human or divine law restrained his vengeance or his cupidity. The day on which the Athenians decreed that all the Mytileneans, without distinction of age or sex, should be exterminated, they did not dream of transcending their rights, and when on the next day they revoked their decree and contented themselves with putting 1,000 citizens to death and confiscating all the lands, they thought themselves humane and indulgent. After the taking of Plataea, the men were put to death and the women sold, and yet no one accused the conquerors of having violated any law. These men made war not only upon soldiers, but upon an entire population, men, women, children, and slaves. They waged it not only against human beings, but against fields and crops. They burned houses and cut down trees. The harvest of the enemy was almost always devoted to the infernal gods, and consequently burned. They exterminated the cattle. They even destroyed the seed which might produce a crop the following year. A war might cause the name and race of an entire people to disappear at a single blow, and change a fertile country into a desert. It was by virtue of this law of war that the Romans extended a solitude around their city. Of the territory where the Volscians had 23 cities, it made the Pontine marshes. The 53 cities of Latium have disappeared. In Samnium, the places where the Roman armies had passed could no longer be recognized, less by the vestiges of their camps than by the solitude which reigned in the neighborhood. When the conquerors did not exterminate the vanquished, they had a right to suppress their city, that is to say, to break up their religious and political association. The worship then ceased, and the gods were forgotten. The religion of the city being destroyed, the religion of every family disappeared at the same time. The sacred fires were extinguished. With the worship fell the laws, civil rights, the family, property. Everything depended upon religion. Let us listen to the prisoner whose life is spared. He is made to pronounce the following formula: "I give my person, my city, my land, the water that flows over it, my boundary gods, my temples, my movable property, everything which pertains to the gods, these I give to the Roman people." From this moment, the gods, the temples, the houses, the lands, and the people belonged to the victors. We shall relate farther on what the result of this was under the dominion of Rome. When a war did not end by the extermination or subjection of one of the two parties, a treaty of peace might terminate it. But for this, a convention was not sufficient. A religious act was necessary. Every treaty was marked by the immolation of a victim. To sign a treaty is a modern expression. The Latins said, "strike a kid," icere hodus, or fodus. The name of the victim most generally employed for this purpose has remained in the common language to designate the entire act. The Greeks expressed themselves in a similar manner. They said, "offer a libation," spendesthai. The ceremony of the treaty was always accomplished by priests who conformed to the ritual. In Italy they were called feciales, and spendophoroi, or libation carriers, in Greece. These religious ceremonies alone gave a sacred and inviolable character to international conventions. The history of the Caudine Forks is well known. An entire army, through its consuls, quaestors, tribunes, and centurions, had made a convention with the Samnites, but no victims had been offered. The Senate, therefore, believed itself justified in declaring that the treaty was not valid. In annulling it, no pontiff or patriarch believed that he was committing an act of bad faith. It was the universal opinion among the ancients that a man owed no obligations except to his own gods. We may recall the saying of a certain Greek, whose city adored the hero Alabandos. He was speaking to an inhabitant of another city that worshipped Hercules. Alabandos, said he, is a god, and Hercules is not one. With such ideas, it was important, in a treaty of peace, that each city called its own gods to bear witness to its oath. We made a treaty and poured out the libations, said the Plataeans to the Spartans. We called to witness, you the gods of your fathers, we the gods who occupy our country. Both parties tried indeed, if it was possible, to invoke divinities that were common to both cities. They swore by those gods that were visible everywhere, the sun which shines upon all, and the nourishing earth. But the gods of each city and its protecting heroes touched men much more, and it was necessary to call them to witness if men wished to have their oaths really confirmed by religion. As the gods mingled in the battles during the war, they had to be included in the treaty. It was stipulated, therefore, that there should be an alliance between the gods as between the men of the two cities. To indicate this alliance of the gods, it sometimes happened that the two peoples agreed mutually to take part in each other's sacred festivals. Sometimes they opened their temples to each other and made an exchange of religious rites. Rome once stipulated that the city god of Lanuvium should thenceforth protect the Romans, who should have the right to invoke him and to enter his temple. Afterwards, each of the contracting parties engaged to worship the divinities of the other. Thus the Eleans, having concluded a treaty with the Aetolians, thenceforth offered an annual sacrifice to the heroes of their allies. It often happened, after an alliance, that the divinities of two cities were represented by statues or medals holding one another by the hand. Thus it is that there are medals on which are seen united the Apollo of Miletus and the Genius of Smyrna, the Pallas of the Cydians and the Artemis of Perga, the Apollo of Hierapolis and the Artemis of Ephesus. Virgil, speaking of an alliance between Thrace and the Trojans, represents the Penates of the two nations united and associated. These strange customs correspond perfectly with the idea which the ancients had of the gods. As every city had its own, it seemed natural that these gods should figure in battles and treaties. War or peace between two cities was war or peace between two religions. International law among the ancients was long founded upon this principle. When the gods were enemies, there was war without mercy and without law. As soon as they were friends, the men were united and entertained ideas of reciprocal duties. If they could imagine that the protecting divinities of two cities had some motive for becoming allies, this was reason enough why the two cities should become so. The first city with which Rome contracted ties of friendship was Carrhae, in Etruria, and Livy gives the reason for this. In the disaster of the Gallic invasion, the Roman gods had found an asylum in Carrhae. They had inhabited that city and had been adored there. A sacred bond of friendship was thus established between the Roman gods and the Etruscan city. Thenceforth, religion would not permit the two cities to be enemies. They were allied forever. Footnote: It does not enter into our plan to speak of the numerous confederations, or amphictyonies, in ancient Greece and Italy. We will only remark here that they were as much religious as political associations. There was not one of them that had not a common worship and a sanctuary. That of the Boeotians worshipped Athena Itonia, that of the Achaeans Demeter Panachaea. The god of the Ionians in Asia Minor was Poseidon Heliconius, and that of the Dorian Pentapolis was Apollo Triopicus. The confederation of the Cyclades offered a common sacrifice in the Isle of Delos, the cities of Argolis at Caloria. The Amphictyony of Thermopylae was an association of the same nature. All their meetings took place in temples and were principally for offering sacrifices. Each of the confederate cities sent citizens clothed for the time with a sacerdotal character, called theori, to take part in these meetings. A victim was slain in honor of the god of the association, and the flesh cooked upon the altar was shared among the representatives of the cities. The common meal, with the songs, prayers, and sacred plays that accompanied them, formed the bond of the confederation. The same usage existed in Italy. The cities of Latium had the Feriae Latinae, in which they shared the flesh of a victim. It was the same with the Etruscan cities. Besides, in all these Amphictyonies, the political bond was always weaker than the religious one. The Confederate cities preserved perfect independence. They might even make war against each other, provided they observed a truce during the federal festival. The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 16, The Roman, the Athenian. This same religion which had founded society, and which had governed it for a long time, also gave the human mind its direction, and man his character. By its dogmas and its practices it gave to the Greek and the Roman a certain manner of thinking and acting, and certain habits of which they were a long time in divesting themselves. It showed men gods everywhere, little gods, gods easily irritated and malevolent. It crushed man with the fear of always having gods against him, and left him no liberty in his acts. We must inquire what place religion occupied in the life of a Roman. His house was for him what a temple is for us. He finds there his worship and his gods. His fire is a god. The walls, the doors, the threshold are gods. The boundary marks which surround his field are also gods. The tomb is an altar, and his ancestors are divine beings. Each one of his daily actions is a rite. His whole day belongs to his religion. Morning and evening he invokes his fire, his penates, and his ancestors. In leaving and entering his house he addresses a prayer to them. Every meal is a religious act, which he shares with his domestic divinities. Birth, initiation, the taking of the toga, marriage, and the anniversaries of all these events are the solemn acts of his worship. He leaves his house and can hardly take a step without meeting some sacred object, either a chapel, or a place formerly struck by lightning, or a tomb. Sometimes he must step back and pronounce a prayer. Sometimes he must turn his eyes and cover his face to avoid the sight of some ill-boding object. Every day he sacrifices in his house, every month in his curie, several months a year with his gens, or his tribe. Above all these gods he must offer worship to those of the city. There are in Rome more gods than citizens. He offers sacrifices to thank the gods. He offers them, and by far the greater number, to appease their wrath. One day he figures in a procession, dancing after a certain ancient rhythm, to the sound of the sacred flute. Another day he conducts chariots in which lie statues of the divinities. Another time it is a lectisternium. A table is set in a street and loaded with provisions. Upon beds lie statues of the gods, and every Roman passes, bowing, with a crown upon his head and a branch of laurel in his hand. There is a festival for seed time, one for the harvest, and one for the pruning of the vines. Before corn has reached the ear, the Roman has offered more than 10 sacrifices and invoked some 10 divinities for the success of his harvest. He has, above all, a multitude of festivals for the dead, because he is afraid of them. He never leaves his own house without looking to see if any bird of bad augury appears. There are words which he dares not pronounce for his life. If he experiences some desire, he inscribes his wish upon a tablet which he places at the feet of the statue of a divinity. At every moment he consults the gods and wishes to know their will. He finds all his resolutions in the entrails of victims, in the flight of birds, in the warning of the lightning. The announcement of a shower of blood, or of an ox that has spoken, troubles him and makes him tremble. He will be tranquil only after an expiatory ceremony shall restore him to peace with the gods. He steps out of his house always with the right foot first. He has his hair cut only during the full moon. He carries amulets upon his person. He covers the walls of his house with magic inscriptions against fire. He knows of formulas for avoiding sickness, and of others for curing it. But he must repeat them 27 times and spit in a certain fashion at each repetition. He does not deliberate in the Senate if the victims have not given favorable signs. He leaves the assembly of the people if he hears the cry of a mouse. He renounces the best-laid plans if he perceives a bad presage, or if an ill-omened word has struck his ear. He is brave in battle, but on condition that the auspices assure him the victory. This Roman whom we present here is not the man of the people, the feeble-minded man whom misery and ignorance have made superstitious. We are speaking of the patrician, the noble, powerful, rich man. This patrician is, by turns, warrior, magistrate, consul, farmer, merchant. But everywhere and always he is a priest, and his thoughts are fixed upon the gods. Patriotism, love of glory, and love of gold, whatever power these may have over his soul, the fear of the gods still governs everything. Horace has written the most striking truth concerning the Romans, Dis te minorum quod geris imperas. Men have sometimes called this a political religion, but can we suppose that a Senate of 300 members, a body of 3,000 patricians, should have agreed so unanimously to deceive an ignorant people? And that for ages, during so many rivalries, struggles, and personal hatreds, not a single voice was raised to say, "This is a falsehood"? If a patrician had betrayed the secrets of his sect, if, addressing himself to the plebeians, who impatiently supported the yoke of this religion, he had disembarrassed and freed them from these auspices and priesthoods, this man would immediately have obtained so much credit that he might have become the master of the state. Does anyone suppose that if these patricians had not believed in the religion which they practiced, such a temptation would not have been strong enough to determine at least one among them to reveal the secret? We greatly deceive ourselves on the nature of man if we suppose a religion can be established by convention and supported by imposture. Let anyone count in Livy how many times this religion embarrassed the patricians themselves, how many times it stood in the way of the Senate and impeded its action, and then decide if this religion was invented for the convenience of statesmen. It was very late, not till the time of the Scipios, that they began to believe that religion was useful to the government, but then religion was already dead in their minds. Let us take a Roman of the first days. We will choose one of the greatest commanders, Camillus, who was 5 times dictator and who was victorious in more than 10 battles. To be just, we must consider him quite as much a priest as a warrior. He belonged to the Furian gens. His surname is a word which designates a priestly function. When a child, he was required to wear the praetexta, which indicated his caste, and the bulla, which kept bad fortune from him. He grew up, taking a daily part in the ceremonies of the worship. He passed his youth in studying religious rites. A war broke out, and the priest became a soldier. He was seen, when wounded in the thigh, in a cavalry combat, to draw the iron from the wound and continue to fight. After several campaigns he was raised to magistracies. As consular tribune he offered the public sacrifices, acted as judge, and commanded the army. A day comes when men think of him for the dictatorship. On that day, the magistrate in office, after having watched during a clear night, consults the gods. His thoughts are fixed upon Camillus, whose name he pronounces in a low voice. And his eyes are fixed upon the heavens, where he seeks the presages. The gods send only good ones, for Camillus is agreeable to them, and he is named dictator. Now, as chief of the army, he leaves the city, not without having consulted the auspices and slain many victims. He has under his orders many officers and almost as many priests, a pontiff, augurs, aruspices, keepers of the sacred chickens, assistants at sacrifices, and a bearer of the sacred fire. His work is to finish the war against Veii, which for 9 years has been besieged without success. Veii is an Etruscan city, that is to say, almost a sacred city. It is against piety more than courage that the Romans have to contend. If the Romans have been unsuccessful for 9 years, it is because the Etruscans have a better knowledge of the rites that are agreeable to the gods, and the magic formulas that gain their favor. Rome, on her side, has opened the Sibylline books, and has sought the will of the gods there. It appears that the Latin festival has been vitiated by some neglect of form, and the sacrifice is renewed. Still the Etruscans retain their superiority. Only one resource is left, to seize an Etruscan priest and learn the secret of the gods from him. A Veientine priest is taken and brought to the Senate. To ensure the success of Rome, he says, the level of the Alban lake must be lowered, taking good care that the water does not run into the sea. The Romans obey. They dig many canals and ditches, and the water of the lake is lost in the plain. At this moment Camillus is elected dictator. He repairs to the army at Veii. He is sure of success, for all the oracles have been revealed, all the commands of the gods have been fulfilled. Moreover, before leaving Rome, he has promised the protecting gods festivals and sacrifices. In order to ensure success, he does not neglect human means. He increases the army, improves its discipline, and constructs a subterranean gallery to penetrate into the citadel. The day for the attack arrives. Camillus leaves his tent, he takes the auspices and sacrifices victims. The pontiffs and augurs surround him. Clothed in a paludamentum, he invokes the gods. Under thy conduct, O Apollo, and by thy will which inspires me, I march to take and destroy the city of Veii. To thee I promise and devote a 10th part of the spoils. But it is not enough to have gods on his side. The enemy also has a powerful divinity that protects him. Camillus invokes this divinity in these words: Queen Juno, who at present inhabitest Veii, I pray thee, come with us, conquerors, follow us into our city, let our city become thine. Then, the sacrifices being finished, the prayers pronounced, the formulas recited, when the Romans are sure that the gods are for them, and no god any longer defends the enemy, the assault is made, and the city is taken. Such was Camillus. A Roman general was a man who understood admirably how to fight, who knew, above all, how to command obedience, but who believed firmly in the augurs, who performed religious acts every day, and who was convinced that what was of most importance was not courage, or even discipline, but the enunciation of certain formulas exactly pronounced according to the rites. These formulas, addressed to the gods, determined them and constrained them almost always to give him the victory. For such a general, the supreme recompense was for the Senate to permit him to offer the triumphal sacrifice. Then he ascends the sacred chariot drawn by 4 white horses. He wears the sacred robe with which the gods are clothed on festal days. His head is crowned, his right hand holds a laurel branch, his left the ivory scepter. These are exactly the attributes and the costume of Jupiter's statue. With this almost divine majesty he shows himself to the citizens, and goes to render homage to the true majesty of the greatest of the Roman gods. He climbs the slope of the Capitol, arrives before the temple of Jupiter, and immolates victims. The fear of the gods was not a sentiment peculiar to the Roman. It also reigned in the heart of the Greek. These peoples, originally established by religion, and elevated by it, long preserved the marks of their first education. We know the scruples of the Spartan, who never commenced an expedition before the full moon, who was continually sacrificing victims to know whether he ought to fight, and who renounced the best planned and most necessary enterprises because a bad presage frightened him. The Athenian was not less scrupulous. An Athenian army never set out on a campaign before the 7th day of the month, and when a fleet set sail on an expedition, great care was taken to re-gild the statue of Pallas. Xenophon declares that the Athenians had more religious festivals than any other Greek people. "How many victims offered to the gods," says Aristophanes, "how many temples, how many statues, how many sacred processions. At every moment of the year we see religious feasts and crowned victims." The city of Athens and its territory are covered with temples and chapels. Some are for the city worship, others for the tribes and demes, and still others for family worship. Every house is itself a temple, and in every field there is a sacred tomb. The Athenian whom we picture to ourselves as so inconstant, so capricious, such a free thinker, has, on the contrary, a singular respect for ancient traditions and ancient rites. His principal religion, that which secures his most fervent devotion, is the worship of ancestors and heroes. He worships the dead and fears them. One of his laws obliges him to offer them yearly the first fruits of his harvest. Another forbids him to pronounce a single word that can call down their anger. Whatever relates to antiquity is sacred to the Athenian. He has old collections in which are recorded his rites, from which he never departs. If a priest introduces the slightest innovation into the worship, he is punished with death. The strangest rites are observed from age to age. One day in the year the Athenians offer a sacrifice in honor of Ariadne, and because it was said that the beloved of Theseus died in childbirth, they are compelled to imitate the cries and movements of a woman in travail. They celebrate another festival called Oschophoria, which is a sort of pantomime representing the return of Theseus to Attica. They crown the wand of a herald because Theseus's herald crowned his staff. They utter a certain cry which they suppose the herald uttered, and a procession is formed, and each wears the costume that was in fashion in Theseus's time. On another day, the Athenians did not fail to boil vegetables in a pot of a certain kind. This was a rite the origin of which was lost in dim antiquity, and of which no one knew the significance, but which was piously renewed each year. The Athenian, like the Roman, had unlucky days. On these days no marriage took place, no enterprise was begun, no assembly was held, and justice was not administered. The 18th and 19th day of every month was employed in purifications. The day of the Plinteria, a day unlucky above all, they veiled the statue of the great Athena Polias. On the contrary, on the day of the Panathenea, the veil of the goddess was carried in grand procession, and all the citizens, without distinction of age or rank, made up the cortege. The Athenian offered sacrifices for the harvests, for the return of the rain, and for the return of fair weather. He offered them to cure sickness, and to drive away famine or pestilence. Athens has its collection of ancient oracles, as Rome has her Sibylline books, and supports in the Prytaneum men who foretell the future. In her streets we meet at every step soothsayers, priests, and interpreters of dreams. The Athenian believes in portents. Sneezing or ringing in the ears arrests him in an enterprise. He never goes on shipboard without taking the auspices. Before marrying, he does not fail to consult the flight of birds. The assembly of the people disperses as soon as anyone declares that there has appeared in the heavens an ill-boding sign. If a sacrifice has been disturbed by the announcement of bad news, it must be recommenced. The Athenian hardly commences a sentence without first invoking good fortune. He puts the same words at the head of all his decrees. On the speaker's stand, the orator prefers to commence with an invocation to the gods and heroes who inhabit the country. The people are led by oracles. The orators, to give their advice more force, repeat at every moment, "The goddess ordains thus." Nicias belongs to a great and rich family. While still young, he conducts to the sanctuary of Delos a theoria, that is to say victims, and a chorus to sing the praises of the god during the sacrifice. Returning to Athens, he offers a part of his fortune in homage to the gods, dedicating a statue to Athena and a chapel to Dionysius. By turns, he is hesitator and pays the expense of the sacred repast of his tribe, and chorigos, when he supports a chorus for the religious festivals. No day passes that he does not offer a sacrifice to some god. He has a soothsayer attached to his house, who never leaves it, and whom he consults on public affairs, as well as on his own. Having been appointed a general, he commands an expedition against Corinth. While he is returning victorious to Athens, he perceives that 2 of his dead soldiers have been left without burial upon the enemy's territory. He is seized with a religious scruple. He stops his fleet and sends a herald to demand of the Corinthians permission to bury the 2 bodies. Some time after, the Athenian people are deliberating upon the Sicilian expedition. Nicias ascends the speaker's stand and declares that his priests and soothsayers announce prestiges which are opposed to the expedition. Alcibiades, it is true, has other diviners who interpret the oracles in a contrary sense. The people are undecided. Men come in who have just arrived from Egypt. They have consulted the god Ammon, who is beginning to be quite the fashion, and they report this oracle from him. The Athenians will capture all the Syracusans. The people immediately decide for war. Nicias, much against his will, commands the expedition. Before setting out, he offers a sacrifice according to custom. He takes with him, like other generals, a troop of diviners, sacrificers, aruspices, and heralds. The fleet carries its sacred fire. Every vessel has an emblem representing some god. But Nicias has little hope. Is not misfortune announced by prodigies enough? Crows have injured a statue of Pallas. A man has mutilated himself upon an altar, and the departure takes place during the unlucky days of the Plinteria. Nicias knows only too well that this war will be fatal to him and his country. During the whole course of his campaign, he always appears timorous and circumspect. He hardly dares to give the signal for a battle, he whom they know to be so brave a soldier and so skillful a general. The Athenians cannot take Syracuse, and after cruel losses they are forced to decide upon returning home. Nicias prepares his fleet for the return. The sea is still free. But an eclipse of the moon happens. He consults his diviner. The diviner answers that the presage is unfavorable, and that they must wait 3 times 9 days. Nicias obeys. He passes all this time inactive, offering many sacrifices to appease the wrath of the gods. During this delay, the enemy close up the port and destroy his fleet. Nothing is left for him but to retreat by land, and this is impossible. Neither he nor any of his soldiers escapes the Syracusans. What did the Athenians say at the news of this disaster? They knew the personal courage of Nicias and his admirable constancy, nor did they dream of blaming him for having followed the dictates of religion. They found but one thing to reproach him for. This was for having taken with him an ignorant diviner. For this man had been mistaken as to the meaning of the eclipse of the moon. He ought to have known that, for an army wishing to retreat, a moon that conceals its light is a favorable presage. The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 17, The Omnipotence of the State. The ancients knew nothing of individual liberty. The city had been founded upon a religion, and constituted like a church. Hence its strength, hence also its omnipotence and the absolute empire which it exercised over its members. In a society established on such principles, individual liberty could not exist. The citizen was subordinate in everything, and without any reserve, to the city. He belonged to it, body and soul. The religion which had produced the state, and the state which supported the religion, sustained each other, and made but one. These 2 powers, associated and confounded, formed a power almost superhuman, to which the soul and the body were equally enslaved. There was nothing independent in man. His body belonged to the state, and was devoted to its defense. At Rome, military service was due till a man was 50 years old, at Athens till he was 60, at Sparta always. His fortune was always at the disposal of the state. If the city had need of money, it could order the women to deliver up their jewels, the creditors to give up their claims, and the owners of olive trees to turn over gratuitously the oil which they had made. Private life did not escape this omnipotence of the state. The Athenian law, in the name of religion, forbade man to remain single. Sparta punished not only those who remained single, but those who married late. At Athens, the state could prescribe labor, and at Sparta, idleness. It exercised its tyranny in even the smallest things. At Locri, the laws forbade men to drink pure wine. At Rome, Miletus, and Marseille, wine was forbidden to women. It was a common thing for the kind of dress to be invariably fixed by each city. The legislation of Sparta regulated the headdress of women, and that of Athens forbade them to take with them on a journey more than 3 dresses. At Rhodes and Byzantium, the law forbade men to shave the beard. The state was under no obligation to suffer any of its citizens to be deformed. It therefore commanded a father to whom such a son was born to have him put to death. This law is found in the ancient codes of Sparta and of Rome. We do not know that it existed at Athens. We know only that Aristotle and Plato incorporated it into their ideal codes. There is, in the history of Sparta, one trait which Plutarch and Rousseau greatly admired. Sparta had just suffered a defeat at Leuctra, and many of its citizens had perished. On receipt of this news, the relatives of the dead had to show themselves in public with gay countenances. The mother who learned that her son had escaped, and that she should see him again, appeared afflicted and wept. Another, who knew that she should never again see her son, appeared joyous and went round to the temple to thank the gods. What then was the power of the state that could thus order the reversal of the natural sentiments and be obeyed? The state allowed no man to be indifferent to its interests. The philosopher or the studious man had no right to live apart. He was obliged to vote in the assembly, and be magistrate in his turn. At a time when discords were frequent, the Athenian law permitted no one to remain neutral. He must take sides with one or the other party. Against one who attempted to remain indifferent and not side with either faction, and to appear calm, the law pronounced the punishment of exile with confiscation of property. Education was far from being free among the Greeks. On the contrary, there was nothing over which the state had greater control. At Sparta, the father could have nothing to do with the education of his son. The law appears to have been less rigorous at Athens. Still, the state managed to have education in the hands of masters of its own choosing. Aristophanes, in an eloquent passage, shows the Athenian children on their way to school. In order, distributed according to their district, they march in serried ranks, through rain, snow, or scorching heat. These children seem already to understand that they are performing a public duty. The state wished alone to control education, and Plato gives the motive for this. Parents ought not to be free to send or not to send their children to the masters whom the city has chosen, for the children belong less to their parents than to the city. The state considered the mind and body of every citizen as belonging to it, and wished, therefore, to fashion this body and mind in a manner that would enable it to draw the greatest advantage from them. Children were taught gymnastics because the body of a man was an arm for the city, and it was best that this arm should be as strong and as skillful as possible. They were also taught religious songs and hymns, and the sacred dances, because this knowledge was necessary to the correct performance of the sacrifices and festivals of the city. It was admitted that the state had a right to prevent free instruction by the side of its own. One day Athens made a law forbidding the instruction of young people without authority from the magistrates, and another which specially forbade the teaching of philosophy. A man had no chance to choose his belief. He must believe and submit to the religion of the city. He could hate and despise the gods of the neighboring city. As to the divinities of a general and universal character, like Jupiter, or Cybele, or Juno, he was free to believe or not to believe in them. But it would not do to entertain doubts about Athena Polias, or Erechtheus, or Cecrops. That would have been grave impiety, which would have endangered religion and the state at the same time, and which the state would have severely punished. Socrates was put to death for this crime. Liberty of thought in regard to the state religion was absolutely unknown among the ancients. Men had to conform to all the rules of worship, figure in all the processions, and take part in the sacred repasts. Athenian legislation punished those by a fine who failed religiously to celebrate a national festival. The ancients, therefore, knew neither liberty in private life, liberty in education, nor religious liberty. The human person counted for very little against that holy and almost divine authority which was called country or the state. The state had not only, as we have in our modern societies, a right to administer justice to the citizens, it could strike when one was not guilty, and simply for its own interest. Aristides assuredly had committed no crime, and was not even suspected, but the city had the right to drive him from its territory, for the simple reason that he had acquired by his virtues too much influence, and might become dangerous, if he desired to be. This was called ostracism. This institution was not peculiar to Athens. It was found at Argos, at Megara, at Syracuse, and we may believe that it existed in all the Greek cities. Now, ostracism was not a chastisement. It was a precaution which the city took against a citizen whom it suspected of having the power to injure it at any time. At Athens, a man could be put on trial and condemned for incivism, that is to say, for the want of affection towards the state. A man's life was guaranteed by nothing so soon as the interest of the state was at stake. Rome made a law by which it was permitted to kill any man who might have the intention of becoming king. The dangerous maxim that the safety of the state is the supreme law was the work of antiquity. It was then thought that law, justice, morals, everything should give way before the interests of the country. It is a singular error, therefore, among all human errors, to believe that in the ancient cities men enjoyed liberty. They had not even the idea of it. They did not believe that there could exist any right as against the city and its gods. We shall see farther on that the government changed form several times, while the nature of the state remained nearly the same, and its omnipotence was little diminished. The government was called by turns monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, but none of these revolutions gave man true liberty, individual liberty. To have political rights, to vote, to name magistrates, to have the privilege of being archon, this was called liberty. But man was not the less enslaved to the state. The ancients, especially the Greeks, always exaggerated the importance, and above all the rights, of society. This was largely due, doubtless, to the sacred and religious character with which society was clothed in the beginning.